So what we were attacked for by Brendan Cooney, what I was attacked for, I should say, by Brendan Cooney around the criticism of Me Too back in 2018. Said there was a millennial sex panic. I knew what I was talking about. I knew that this was the rehabilitation of second wave feminism was anti-sex.
We're going to be talking about an essay you wrote for Nonsite in 2012 that's a part of your book, Marxism and Politics, and it's entitled, Do We Need Adorno? That's what we're scheduled to speak to and about. I think the answer is yes, but I want to ask you to summarize what you think the primary argument for Adorno might be today, and what should people get out of this essay when they encounter it in the book?
Okay, so in the book Marxism and Politics, which is coming out just about now, it's in final production. I use this essay as a kind of opening piece. So I also use a piece that I wrote for Platypus in 2006, like Short History of the Left, in which Adorno prominently features there, but really in order to kind of set up some themes. And the theme is Adorno and Lenin, really. So it's about, one of the things that I helped unearth in the literature, which is a conversation between Horkheimer and Adorno in 1956 that was translated and published by Verso as Towards a New Manifesto. First as an article in New Left Review, and then as a small book by Verso. And Towards a New Manifesto, really this is where Horkheimer and Adorno kind of talk about being Leninist and wanting to be true to Lenin. And if you were to rewrite the Communist Manifesto for the 20th century, it would have to be strictly Leninist. And again, what does that mean, right? Because the Frankfurt School would be considered the very opposite of Leninism. So if Lenin is the man of action, if he's the what is to be done guy, they're the contemplative intellectuals who are just stuck in thinking and theory, right? And so Lenin would seem to be the opposite of that, and yet they didn't think so. And so I use that as a device to talk about how Lenin is misunderstood. In other words, not only is the Frankfurt School misunderstood as somehow not Marxist, but also Lenin is misunderstood as somehow not a critical theorist. He was a critical theorist, and really the whole issue of Marxism theory. In other words, what is Marxism, essentially? And so I just will recall Gershom Scholem, who is a friend of, so he's a Jewish theologian and Zionist friend of Walter Benjamin, and also acquaintance of Horkheimer and Adorno. He criticized Martin Jay in his book, The Dialectical Imagination. There was this thing, critical theory, that was different from Marxism. And Gershom Scholem said, oh no, critical theory just means Marxism. And anyone who tries to tell you otherwise is just a fraud. Right? That it's just a euphemism for Marxism. That's all that they ever meant by critical theory. It's that they went to the United States and they thought, oh, we can't call ourselves Marxists, so instead we're going to say critical theory. But that's what it meant. And establishing the parameters of that. In other words, why could the term critical theory be used as a euphemism for Marxism?
Right. So my question would be, why did Martin Jay think that critical theory could be separated out from Marxism? What was it that he encountered, or what was he experiencing on the left that made that distinction seem plausible to him, do you think?
Right. So I think that a challenge for people coming up in the 60s like Martin Jay was, could you be a Marxist and not a Stalinist? Right. And, this is the issue that we have out in the public sphere now with people like Gabriel Rockhill attacking the Frankfurt School from a Stalinist perspective and saying that Frankfurt School and critical theory more generally, even including the French fries, so French theory, but also Frankfurt School critical theory, is a theory that is about accommodating imperialism and is about criticizing and opposing the attempts of the oppressed to rise up and change things. Right, so it's Western Marxism is Western because it's imperialist, pro-imperialist. It's contrary to anti-imperialism, et cetera, et cetera. So we're dealing with that, and certainly that was something that the 60s generation faced. But then they were aware that there was such a thing as Trotskyism, but they also thought that Trotskyism was kind of Stalinist-y anyway. So really it comes down to Lenin, right? So what Trotsky and Stalin have in common is that they're both Leninists, or both claim to be Leninist. And so the real issue is not Stalinism, but Lenin and Leninism. And so that's why it's the big scandal. I gave a presentation at the 40th anniversary of Adorno's death in 2009 at Sussex, at the University of Sussex in Brighton in the UK, in which I was one of the kind of keynote speakers, and I gave a talk on how Adorno was a Leninist. And it's out of that conference that they decided to translate and publish Towards the New Manifesto text, because I cited that text. So that's how that happened, right? But it was like a mic drop moment, the tension here was palpable, and people were like, how can you say this? What do you mean? And so I had to try to explain it even beyond the presentation that I made, which was part of my dissertation. That's what I was presenting in 2009. So now, come full circle, this piece, this is just a little aside, we'll get back to the Martin J question. Todd Cronin, who is the founding editor of Nonsite, and Nonsite, by the way, on the editorial board are people who I know and are near and dear to me, like Adolph Reed and Robert Pippin and Kenneth Warren and Walter Ben Michaels, and I think Michael Fried also. So that they have a kind of luminary editorial board, but Todd Cronin began the journal Nonsite, and this whole symposium on Adorno came out of his critical book review of Towards the New Manifesto. So he wrote in Radical Philosophy, in the journal Radical Philosophy. He wrote an article that was, you are all proletarians now, or we are all proletarians now. There are two versions of the essay. He changed we and you between the Radical Philosophy Journal version and the Nonsite version. And he was sort of making fun of, like, oh, Adorno's saying everybody's a proletarian now. And because, of course, what those guys over at Nonsite are really concerned with is what a lot of people are concerned with, the PMC. How can you say that everyone's a proletarian? What about the PMC? They're not proletarian, right? And these critical theorists, wait, is this the origin of the effacing of the PMC problem? That Adorno was like, everybody's a proletarian in capitalism, right? So it's getting rid of the class struggle. Todd Cronin thought that the Frankfurt School got rid of the class struggle. And one of the ways that they did that, ironically enough, was to say, well, everybody's a proletarian in advanced capitalism. Right. So Martin J, going back a generation. So Todd Cronin is our generation.
Right.
Going back to Martin J's generation, of course, in the 60s, there is this question of the revolutionary subject. And is it no longer the working class? Is it no longer the industrial proletariat? Or is it students? Or is it peasants? Or is it somebody else, women? Is it minorities, racial minorities? Is it queers, right? Who's the new revolutionary subject? And that the Frankfurt School moved from a theory of capitalism as exploitation to modernity as domination seemed in this ambivalent way foreshadow the new revolutionary subject. Right, so why the Frankfurt School could be inspirational for the New Left, but also a bone of contention for the New Left, is to say, well, there's like a new contradiction. It's no longer the class struggle of the workers against the capitalists. It's more domination. And Martin J and others thought that the turning point was a dialectic of enlightenment. that the dialectic of enlightenment as a story of domination rather than of class exploitation and class struggle is the turning away from Marxism by the Frankfurt School. And of course it's not, right? So 10 years later, they're saying we want a Leninist manifesto. We want to recover the memory of socialism. We want to, and they're looking very concretely. They're like, who would be an audience for this? Who would read this? Right? And they're like, well, nobody, and nobody in Russia, because the Russians are all fascists, and nobody in America, and nobody in Britain, because they would just be Labour Party people. So maybe France and Italy, because they still have these communist parties. Maybe, right? But even then it's kind of questionable, right? But this is their and why they don't write it. They don't write it. Like, they don't ultimately write the new manifesto for the 20th century, the opportunity for which was the Khrushchev speech. So when Khrushchev did a Leninist criticism of Stalin, when he said Stalin committed crimes against Leninism, right? They're like, well, that's true, but Khrushchev doesn't mean what we would mean. And so what would we mean? That Stalin is some kind of betrayal of Lenin and betrayal of Marxism. You can't be a Marxist without being a Leninist. That was the Frankfurt School position. And they were very straightforward about that. I always like to point out Karl Popper had a famous public debate with Adorno and Habermas. So it's a positivist dispute in German sociology is what it's called historically. So Karl Popper and Ralph Dahrendorf, who was an ex-student of the Frankfurt School, he turned against them. They were the liberals debating Adorno and Habermas as the Marxists, and Popper kept bringing up Lenin against Adorno. Popper kept on saying, well, that doesn't sound very Leninist. What would Lenin say about what you're saying? Like, teasing him, kind of, kind of poking him with that. So, which is amusing, because after all, Popper knew that Adorno was a Leninist, right? In a way that has not been terribly clear to people since then.
Well, what does it mean to be a Leninist like Adorno?
Good point, because that's really what we're talking about. In other words, I'll invoke the Marxist humanists, since that's the point of contact between me and you. So we know Andrew Kleiman, we know Peter Hudis, we know Kevin Anderson. Do you know Kevin Anderson?
Yeah, I've heard of it. Kevin Anderson. I haven't read him much, but yeah.
Oh, you haven't? And have you met him?
No, I don't think so. But I know he's the other one. Is he the one that's still in News and Letters?
No, they all left. They were all purged, actually. They were all purged together. And his wife is Janet Afari, who's an Iranian leftist and who wrote a book about Foucault and Iran.
So he must be part of the, in my humble opinion.
Yes, National Marxist Humanist Organization, absolutely. And he wrote a book, Marx at the Margins, on the late writings of Marx and how it's compatible with, anti-racism, etc. And Spencer Leonard has had a lot of correspondence and interaction with Kevin. But anyway, Kevin Anderson, on a panel, the very first panel that Platypus ever held on imperialism back in 2007, he was on that panel, and he said, we need to differentiate the critical Marxists from the more positive and affirmative Marxists. So he identified himself, and also Platypus at that time, with what he called critical Marxism. Right? And he is also someone who, they have an ambivalent relationship to Lenin. The followers of Raya Dunevskaya, they give some credit to Lenin, but they're also critical of Lenin, in the same way that they give some credit to Trotsky, but are critical of Trotsky. Right? And they're more Luxemburgist, but they're even critical of Rosa Luxemburg as well. But nonetheless, what they like about Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky is that they're critical Marxists. Right? In other words, they're not just like rah-rah cheerleaders for the party. They're not just followers of the party line. They're critics.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that's the proper role of Marxism. And that's what people usually lose about Lenin. They lose the fact that Lenin was a critic of his Marxist contemporaries, and not a critic in the sense of he's the one true Marxist or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like positively, like he's got the right program and they have the wrong program. But in a deeper sense, that actually Marxism is criticism, is critical. It's the self-criticism, unfortunate term from Maoism. It's the self-critical perspective of this workers' movement for socialism. That you only need Marxism as a critical perspective, a critique, a self-critique of the workers in their struggle for socialism. That's what you need Marxism for. You don't need Marxism positively because the working class generated its own demands, its own program, its own goal, its own desire for socialism. The necessity of Marxism was a critical awareness of that struggle and how that struggle is bound up with the problem it's trying to overcome, capitalism. Right? That it's not like some other thing, which is the way most people on the left, most people think, that capitalism is like the capitalists and what they do, and then workers are outside of that, and then they'll expand it. It will be like, well, the white capitalists is what they do, and then the black people are outside of that. Or it's the male capitalists, it's what they do, and women are outside of that. Or it's the straight heteronormative capitalists, it's what they do, not what the queers and the trans do.
It starts to get really crazy, I think, at that point. I mean,
right?
But even before, it's all crazy. But yeah.
Right. Because it's not what the capitalists do. In other words, the Marxist perspective on capitalism is that it's generated and regenerated from below, and its history is about what the workers did, and its future and its potential overcoming is all dependent on what the workers do. Right? But again, that kind of dialectical.
That's something I did learn from the Marxist humanists, which was that when you read Capital and you read even Raya Dostoevskaya, the idea that capitalism is something that apart from the working class has to be dropped. Once you put the law of value at the center of your critique, you can't have that opinion anymore about capitalism.
Right.
And that's, for a long time, that was why I held on so tightly to that law of value. It's kind of a very secure place to be in my politics. It's like, okay, I know what we're trying to overcome, and that's all I need to know. Damn it, I don't need to know. But I want to. I would just
say about that that you can flip it both ways. In other words, that keeping attention to the law of value is the way of understanding that the working class is at the center of capitalism. But you could also flip it the other way, and recognizing the working class as the center of capitalism allows you to understand the proper place of the Marxist value.
Right, but as a Marxist humanist, workers are more than their ability to produce value. Right?
That's true. That's true. So that's the humanism. That's the little romanticism to it.
Right. That's right. But I can't just give up all of my romanticism in one go. It'll take me a long time.
It does. It takes a lot of re-education. No, I mean, because it seems like, let me just say this also about the Frankfurt School in their moment, which is, the 50s and 60s, and also where someone like Gabriel Rockhill is coming from. Althusser, so like structural Marxism or scientific Marxism as opposed to humanistic Marxism would also place value at the center.
Would it though? Yeah, I don't think he does. I've read Althusser. He doesn't really talk about the law of value much, and his structuralism is cultural. It's all this ideological apparatus stuff, and it's all coming from
other stuff. It's a reading Capital. It's the thing that he co-wrote with Balibar. And the reason I say this is that the Wertkritik, the value critique people, who were students of Adorno, like Backhouse,
Mm-hmm.
they were inspired by Althusser. So they were reading Althusser and Adorno, and they came about critique or value criticism. And Neue Marx Lektur, the new Marx reading, the new reading of Marx, is inspired in many ways more by Althusser than by Adorno and the Frankfurt School.
Well, I'm sure it is,
And
but the thing about Althusser, now I don't know, this is I'm not a scholar, right? This is my impression, all right?
Uh-huh.
My impression is that Althusser was influenced by Lacan.
Yes.
And that Lacan had a critique of the commodity fetish.
Right.
And it was a psychoanalytic critique, which is basically just wrong and simple-minded. And
simply wrong.
Yeah, it's simply wrong, and it's also simple-minded. You should be able to pick up on the fact that it isn't much.
You know what complicates that a little bit, Doug?
What?
That Lacan has a structuralist reinterpretation of Freud.
Right.
So
which is
in other words,
the whole linguistic turn, though. That's
yes.
the whole. It's all from structuralism, which you have to question. Actually,
I think so. No, I completely agree that this is a problem, but I'm just saying it's kind of mediated. I recently had a debate with Todd McGowan for Theory Underground.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of appeared to agree that he kind of did, and some of the things that I said that were at least implicit criticisms directed in his way, he sort of didn't get as a criticism. And he's like, oh no, I totally agree with Chris. And I was like, but do you?
Mm-hmm.
And, he's a Žižekian and a Lacanian, even though he's ambivalent about Lacan as a person. But I think what there is with Lacan is a kind of structuralist Freudianism. Like it's like a reinterpretation of Freud in structuralist terms, which I think violates the spirit of Freud.
It certainly does, and you can see where it's gone, because the whole critique of the whole anti-racist ex-Kindi or Ta-Nehisi Coates stuff. It's all about systemic racism, but what they really mean is structural racism based on kind of a vaguely defined cultural linguistic mediating structure of society.
Because I'm not against talking about structural racism, but I want to talk about social, political, economic structures. I don't want to talk about structures of thinking. I don't want to talk about white epistemology or something, right? That's not how racism is structural, right?
Yeah, but that's what they mean when you hear systemic racism. You have to ask what's being systematized.
What system? They mean a cultural system. Yeah,
right. Which is basically tautological, kind of circular thing.
Totally.
Yeah. So
that's why Barbara Fields and Karen Fields and Adolf Reed can go to town on them, because they're just like, well, look, it's not like racism just exists. It came into existence historically. It's not just in some structure of thinking or structure of culture, right? In other words, the way they put it is, these guys think that slavery was instituted to enforce whiteness rather than to get cotton picked. Right? It's like,
Yeah, I know. I've heard Adolf say that, and he's totally right. Yeah.
Right. Even if
when I first starting out, getting serious about Marx, and I was interviewing Andrew Kleinman a lot, I was I got excited, and I started reaching out to people I'd already talked to on the podcast to try to tell them about Andrew Kleinman, like I thought they didn't know about him, And I remember I wrote to Jody Dean, and wrote this pretty long email explaining what I thought Andrew Kleinman was pointing at, which is, of course, Marx's, it's capital, but to a large degree, that's what it was. And I said, so according to Kleinman, what's foundational is our material production and the value we produce through labor time. And he can defend this kind of old Marxist theory very, very well. And I think people on the left right now, particularly right now during the economic crisis, during this moment, should pay attention to them. Yep. Yeah. And she said, well, there's something more fundamental, which is language.
Oh, no, Jodi Dean is a French fry. I do respect Jodi Dean. She got suspended from teaching for writing a pro-Palestinian solidarity essay at Verso. Mm-hmm. She got suspended from teaching, which is just wrong. It's just horrible, and that should not have happened. Her essay is also horrible and should not have happened.
Well, should not have
happened.
You have to accept the good with the bad, the bad with the good. But no, I totally agree that Jodi Dean should not have lost her teaching position, and everyone should object to that, just in the same way
absolutely
as we did when Ward Churchill lost his teaching position.
Absolutely.
Back in the day,
Yep. Yep. But, even though Ward Churchill was very wrong as well, but he shouldn't have been penalized for that, for expressing an opinion.
But it was revealing to me that okay, so you have this Zizekian, new communists. New communists to rise in. We're gonna go really into Marx, but ultimately it was structuralism. Language.
It's language.
But Lenin is not a structuralist in that sense.
Well, check it out, Doug. So you know what Jodi Dean's blog is called? Lenin Cat Memes.
It's cute.
All right. So in other words, like, Lenin is a signifier, don't you know?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's important about Lenin. He's a signifier. No, sorry, I'm like an old. So is Mickey Mouse. No, so I'm sorry. I believe I don't believe in signifiers. I believe in actual historical figures who thought and acted and had a practice and a theory and participated in organizations and and were embedded in a history of society and politics. I don't think that Lenin is a meme.
Yeah.
We're recording 2 days after Lenin's birthday, by the way. So we're recording 2 days after Lenin's birthday and Kant's birthday.
Right.
And Lenin and Kant share the same birthday. So it was the 300th birthday, a 300th anniversary of Kant's birth, in April 22nd, 2024. 2024, unfortunately, is the anniversary of Lenin's death. So he didn't die on his birthday. But so Lenin has a kind of an interesting salience just this week, but also this year.
Well, so the other thing I want to say about Lenin is that when I was first deciding that I wanted to read Marx and take him seriously, the other thing that I did was I took this old song by a group called Red Shadow.
Oh, I don't know.
And they had a song called Understanding Marx, and it's like this old folk. It's like a parody song, and it's lines like, "Understanding Marx will straighten out your head more than anything else you've read. Freud's a fraud and Skinner's of no use, but read Marx and Lenin, it will really turn you loose." That's some lines from
Turn You Loose.
Yeah. Yeah. 1975. But then they go on when I read Mao's Little Red Book, I really understood. They also said that in 1975 in the same song. But I put this out there. I found it on YouTube or something and put it on Facebook. And one of my listeners to the podcast at that time was like, "How can you support the monster Lenin?"
Yeah.
How can you? And he was like an anarchist.
Yeah.
Listener,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he's responsible for the death of millions along with Stalin. Right. So
is Lenin responsible for the death of millions? No. I mean, the Russian Civil War was very bloody, and I don't know that we can lay all the responsibility for the deaths with Lenin in the Russian Civil War. Certainly not. But it wasn't millions, I don't think. And anyway, most of the people who died in the Russian Civil War were on the red side, not on the white side. And not on the green side, not on the...
No, he just saying everything Stalin did, Lenin did too. That's what he was really saying.
Sure. Maybe Lenin would have... Had he had the chance that Stalin had to kill millions, he would have. Wow. No, when early on in Platypus, we came around to reading Lenin rather late. We started the reading group in 2006, but we didn't come around to reading Lenin until 2007. And, we started out reading, well, these are my students who came out of my Adorno class, whether at the University of Chicago or SAIC, they knew me as a teacher of Adorno. And we started with like Lukács and Karl Korsch, and in other words, the kind of originators of the Frankfurt School, who later turned against the Frankfurt School. They're the sort of progenitors of the Frankfurt School turned against their progeny. And that's also in my book, by the way. In the book, I addressed Lukács and Korsch for this reason. Now, the students who first invited me to start the reading group that became Platypus were grad students of mine at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and they came from an anarchist background. And they left Platypus right before we read Lenin together in Platypus. So there was a lot of anxiety building up. There were other things going on. They had helped organize a panel that we did. So I mentioned the imperialism panel. We did a panel that included anarchists, that included Michael Albert, and also Brian Duncombe. So these are like anarchist intellectuals and scholars. And but they had a lot of frustration dealing with people because people are prickly and they're divas, and it's hard to arrange these panels. It's hard to get speakers because everyone's a diva, everyone's prickly. And so they just got super frustrated, and that might have been a reason that they quit Platypus too, because they were burnt out by trying to organize this panel. It was on the 3 R's: reform, revolution, and resistance. But really, I think they quit because we came to reading Lenin. And one of them was married to an Eastern European woman. And he said, I can't in good conscience, be part of an organization that's reading Lenin, because to my wife, Lenin just means murder. Right? And she was Romanian. But so Lenin had no responsibility there. And yet, right, statues of Lenin, Marxist Leninism, Stalinism. And, and I kind of got it, but I also thought no, because they had previously commended me. I talk about this in the foreword to the book, to Marxism and Politics. They had commended me for transcending the authoritarian versus libertarian division on the left. Right? But then when it came down to it, they were like, no, we can't go with that authoritarianism, Lenin. And I don't see Lenin that way at all. Right, I don't see him as authoritarian in the way that Stalin was. Right. I see Lenin as part of an older tradition, like a tradition, a pre-World War I Marxist tradition. So like Rosa Luxemburg and Trotsky. And of course, Stalin predates. He comes out of that same background, Second International Marxism. But I see them as Second International Marxists, like Eugene Debs, and Debs had a lot in common. Lenin respected Debs a great deal, and Debs famously said that from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, he's a Bolshevik through and through. And this is after the Civil War had already started in Russia. This is in 1919. He actually wrote that in an article condemning the murder of Rosa Luxemburg. So Debs wrote an article condemning Rosa Luxemburg and said, I'm with Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky. I'm one of them. Right? And this was in 1919. So it was already clear. The violence of the Russian Revolution was already clear. The suppression of the opponents by the Bolsheviks had already happened. And Debs was like, yeah, no, I'm with them. So again, because I think that a lot of people, especially Americans, would think of Debs as like a very kind of liberal democratic, kind of reformist, kind of sentimental socialist, not like a hardcore, like revolution, whatever it takes, revolution,
That's because of what came after him too, like Norman Thomas or something.
Yes, who's a famous pacifist, right?
Right.
That's right. Although even Norman Thomas is more serious than that, he's an interesting character as well, but not a Marxist in the same way that Debs was. I mean, the Socialist Party of America did remain Marxist, right? Even if it was like anti-Leninist, it was certainly anti-Stalinist. Again, it's a complicated history. So the sort of unfolding of the 1920s and 1930s, the era of the Frankfurt School coming to consciousness, because they're young. They're like a post-World War I phenomenon as a group, and certainly Horkheimer and Adorno they're usually called the first generation of the Frankfurt School, but in some ways they're the second generation of the Frankfurt School. So Horkheimer took over in 1930. It was led by others before that. And originally, Lukács and Karl Korsch were invited to be the first director of the Frankfurt Institute, and they turned it down because they wanted to stay more politically engaged. So it was Karl Grönberg who ran the Frankfurt School for the first 10 years, and then Horkheimer took it over. And really, the Frankfurt School as we know it crystallized in the 1930s. So this is the era of the emergence of Stalinism. This is the era of the Frankfurt School. They had a direct connection to the Soviet Union because they had a direct connection to the Marx Engels Institute in Moscow. And they were the ones who handled Marx and Engels's papers. So basically, the SPD held those papers. They held the archive of Marx and Engels's writings. And the Soviet Union wanted to publish the complete works of Marx and Engels. And so how are they going to, because across the political divide, the Social Democrats and the Communists were blood enemies. So the Frankfurt Institute, in part, what they did was they were the intermediaries. Right? And the people who ran the Marx Engels Institute in the 1920s and early 1930s were left oppositionists. They're followers of Trotsky. So that's the connection. There's a direct connection between the Frankfurt School and the left opposition in the Soviet Union. So the people who are curating, editing, really producing really scholarly editions of the complete writings of Marx and Engels, the letters, everything. Right. And so the Frankfurt School, they are directly connected to the publication of previously unpublished things like the Grundrisse as a result of this. Right. Because that's how these things are published. They're being published after the Russian Revolution. And it's really a kind of Soviet initiative kind of publication of these otherwise unknown writings by Marx and Engels. And Frankfurt School thinkers, like people like Friedrich Pollock, are really at the center of this kind of we could say an expanded reading of Marx and Engels. So the economic and philosophic manuscripts, the Grundrisse, they're at the core of that. And Erich Fromm is the one who ends up publishing the first English translation of the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844. And he's a member of the Frankfurt Institute until he has a falling out with them during World War II. So, they're very hardcore Marxists and very much involved in what they understood, but also how the Communist International and how the Soviet Marxists understood bringing out the forgotten or neglected Marxism of Marx and Engels.
Can I ask you a side question about Erich Fromm? I've read a little bit of him. I'm supposed to be reading it actually with my girlfriend, The Art of Loving. We're going to
of course. Yeah.
But my understanding of him is that he became sentimental. Or
I guess you could say that. I mean, you could say that he's around the Marxist humanists, around Zhivnevskaya for sure. So like Marcuse, he's in correspondence with Zhivnevskaya, and he definitely has a more humanistic approach.
Well, then I should like him. Yeah,
I mean, that's the thing. He's like a soft, cuddly Marxist. Right. But also he emphasizes freedom. So Flight from Freedom, that's a very famous book of his. Right? I mean, Fromm is interesting. Fromm is interesting. However, it's not in this article, I don't think. It's elsewhere in my book, in Marxism and Politics, that I raise Adorno's criticism of Fromm. Right?
Yeah.
So Adorno's criticism of Fromm is that Fromm should read more Lenin. He says, no, literally, he writes to Horkheimer and he says, Fromm is like going against the journal's line, like the Frankfurt Institute journal's line.
Oh, yeah,
like he's he's contrary to the party line that we have here, and he's going in this anarchist direction. And I would, and from his perspective, there'd be no way of conceiving of like the vanguard party or the revolutionary dictatorship. And so I would recommend that he read it.
Okay. Interesting.
Now Fromm, on the other hand, when he broke with the Frankfurt School, his criticism of his former colleagues was that they write a lot about Freud, but they have no idea what they're talking about because none of them are actual clinicians, and he was.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so, in other words, they just play with these Freudian ideas, but they have no sense of the substance of them, which you need to be a clinician. So he goes in that direction. He really goes in the direction of psychology and of therapy. And that's a respectable direction to go in. So something like The Art of Loving is really based on his clinical insights.
Right. But, when I read that, especially when I encounter Marxists who go in towards therapy, I have a feeling of like, there's something wrong here. Understand? Like, because of
they're abandoning politics. They're abandoning politics in a way.
Well, if they were to just do it all together, that's fine. But when they act as though the therapy is a politics, that
then it tends to be conservative, doesn't it?
Yeah,
tends to be a little conservative, but maybe conservative, but not in a bad way. Maybe in a good way, meaning that they try to retain some like sensibility with respect to actual people, right? Now, of course, that becomes apologetics for capitalism in all sorts of ways. But I have another example in mind. So you brought up Lasch. Juliet Mitchell. Juliet Mitchell moved from Marxism into therapy. She sort of, checked out from politics and just went into being a clinician. And, it's not like she completely abandoned Marxism. She didn't. But she definitely withdrew from the political realm. And even though she thought that there were political stakes to psychology and psychotherapy, she was very careful and responsible about any claims made in that direction. In other words, she didn't like replace Marxism with therapy as a politics. And Fromm didn't do that either. Fromm didn't do that either. And neither did Lasch, because Lasch basically retreated from the political realm into cultural commentary, and that's fine.
No, I mentioned Lasch as a critic of the therapeutic, not as someone who had made that move, but rather the reason I'm critical. I also read The Triumph of the Therapeutic, just a bit of it recently. The Philip Reif, Susan Sontag's husband.
Husband.
I read some of him. So anyhow,
with this and how it ties back to Lenin is that whether it's a therapeutic turn or a critique of the therapeutic turn, right? What it is it's a sort of turn to, it's a lowering of ambitions. So you wouldn't want therapy to replace politics, but you also don't want to take a therapeutic approach to politics. And the reason for that is that, Lenin's perspective, and this is very central to Adorno. So he has a famous letter that he wrote to Walter Benjamin about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, where he said, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are both mutilated personalities in capitalism. And there's no advantage, there's nothing better about the proletariat than the bourgeoisie. They're both deformed bourgeois characters. And so the only difference is that one might have an interest in the revolution where the other doesn't, right? And so we can't celebrate the workers as such. And that's based on Lenin. So in that letter to Benjamin, he invokes Lenin. And he says, Lenin reminds us that we have to make the revolution with people as they're formed and deformed in capitalism. Right. In other words, we're not looking for a kind of ethical politics.
Right.
And I address this in another piece called Adorno's Leninism in the book, where I quote Trotsky from Results and Prospects. That's his pamphlet, his short book on the 1905 revolution, where he talks about, well, look, to have a socialist revolution, you don't need a socialist psychology.
No.
There might be a socialist psychology that comes after we overcome capitalism, but in the meantime, we can't yes, it's true, we can encourage solidarity and things like that, but these things are easily crushed in capitalism. And anyway, we don't want to just do a retread of Christianity. We don't want to say, that the struggle for socialism is based on some Christian ethic. Like, we want to recognize the reason why people are the way they are under capitalism, and we have to make the revolution with people as they are. We can't sort of try to make some new socialist man before the revolution, and
Right.
we can't attribute that to the proletariat. No. So this is just basic Marxism.
What did Adorno mean when he said, was it Adorno who said this? That or was it Benjamin? But anyway, you just said it. But
no, it's Adorno. Yeah.
Okay. You said that the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are both deformed by capitalism. It was Adorno,
yes.
Right? Okay.
Yes.
So what did he mean by deformed? Deformed in comparison to what exactly? How did he recognize the deformity?
Here's the thing that always drives our readers and listeners crazy. It's because they are both, in a sense, sub-bourgeois. In other words, they both are, mutilated by capitalism, that they're both bourgeois subjects to begin with, but deformed bourgeois subjects. In other words, they're not even bourgeois subjects. They're kind of sub-bourgeois, meaning it's a falling from the Enlightenment and from the humanism, right? The kind of bourgeois humanism and bourgeois Enlightenment, the kind of Kantian kind of rational subject, that capitalism destroys that. It destroys it among the workers as well as among the capitalist bourgeoisie. Right? And that's the paradox, because on the one hand, I have another piece in the book on Horkheimer, on the sociology of class relations. And again, the idea being that it's contradictory, meaning that on the one hand, the workers are bourgeois subjects, meaning it is going to be through their rational political choices that socialism will be brought about, and yet under conditions of capitalism that mitigate against being like bourgeois rationalists or something, right? In other words, it's going to be in and through ideological appearances. It's going to be self-contradictory, right? It's going to be beset with the problem of ideology. We mentioned earlier commodity fetishism. Right. And the political theory that they get from Lenin and also from Marxism more generally is that democracy is commodity fetishism too. Right? Democracy and even our cherished thing, civil liberties, the rights of the individual, is also commodity fetishism. So we have to acknowledge that the Stalinists and the Maoists who are like, oh, what is this bourgeois civil society, civil liberties stuff? That's just commodity fetishism. Well, they're right about that. They are. But the point is, we have to approach that dialectically. In other words, that's not like a reason to dismiss them.
Let me just walk through what you mean by this briefly when you say that any of these things that you just said were commodity fetishism as commodity fetishism. My understanding of the fetish nature of the commodity is that in production, when a worker makes something for use, it becomes fetishized as a commodity because the social relations that set up its production and its exchange are happening behind his back, being mediated through money. And they are, put by the wage relation, by the market, the exchange value. And so what is actually a social fact, that is these things that are socially produced through cooperatively, really on one level, appear as natural facts. They become reified. They're fetishized. That's what I think of commodity fetish is. When you say civil liberties is a commodity fetish, I have trouble because civil liberty isn't something that is mediated through market relations or is containing a free
market of ideas.
Only much more indirectly,
indirectly. In other words, when people say free market of ideas, they don't just mean things that you pay money for. Right. They mean a market of ideas as free as any other market. Meaning you take it or leave it. You buy it, you don't buy it. Like in the figurative sense, like I buy your argument, I don't buy your argument. I don't have to exchange money with you, right?
But
It's
in the
just
United States, the civil liberty isn't even the free market of ideas. The civil liberty is negative. It's the state cannot intervene.
In order to allow for people to freely exchange ideas.
Right, that's true. Yeah.
Right? I mean, I would put it this way. So the bourgeois right, right of equality to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are rights of the commodity. I have in another essay, I mentioned the Lukács essay that's in the book in Marxism and Politics. I quote Hannah Arendt, who's like a conservative liberal. And she says, the only way, this is a society of labor, she says. And the only way that you can get people to live with each other in a society of labor is in a state of equality.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we're talking about. Right? We're talking about bourgeois right, the right of labor, the right of the free circulation of commodities, tails civil liberties, these rights that we consider to be inalienable. And the whole point of Marxism is recognizing how in industrial capitalism, we're alienated from our labor, which means that we're alienated from our human rights.
Okay, yeah, I see that now.
Our conception of human rights comes from the rights of labor.
Right.
And the rights of labor come from a society of commodity exchange and production.
Maybe this is my humanism here, but I have a much easier time understanding how the free market of ideas and free expression in general and the right to associate, how these things could lead to the sublation of the conditions that make that possible, the sublation of labor itself or labor power. But I have a much harder time understanding how the production of commodities and the exchange of commodities based on labor time could be sublated through the increase of the labor time. Or
I'll invoke Peter Hudis. So Peter Hudis wrote a book on Marx's theory of social change or something. I forget. It's his PhD dissertation that he published as a book, and he criticizes my old professor Moishe Postone. And what he says is Moishe Postone seems to have this kind of paradoxical idea that socialism will be realized not only on the basis of the realization of living labor, but also based on the realization of dead labor. And I'm like, this shouldn't be contradictory at all. Meaning, of course, overcoming capitalism will be, in a way, the completion of the alienation of labor. Meaning, machines do what they do without pegging the value of their activity to human labor time. Right? So that will be fully alienated labor. Like, in other words, emancipation is the completion of the alienation of labor as well as the restoration of human labor.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the realization of dead labor would mean like everyone gets a house that's been built 10 years ago, or or we're going to use these malls differently, but we're going to realize
the general social intellect. The general social intellect will be reappropriated. But that reappropriation will not mean that like everyone has to become an engineer or something.
Right. And we're not going to have to tear down everything that's all ever been built.
No.
Right.
We can do that, but also here's the really crazy thing, Doug. Value.
Yeah, this is where I have trouble. Go ahead.
This is the really crazy thing, value. We'll say, of course, we can't just eliminate value. Boom. Right? In other words, it does need to be retranslated, if you will. It has to do what it's supposed to do already in capitalism. Right, so the anti-imperialists, Gabriel Rockhill, and critical theory is just an apologia for imperialism. They probably imagine that what you have to do is like smash finance capital, and I don't know, like write off everyone's debt. Right, especially third world debt. And that's plausible, that is. And maybe that is even the way it's going to happen. And yet, what are going to be the trade relations between the United States and Nigeria after the revolution? There's going to have to be a trade relation. In other words, the United States is still going to need oil and other things from Nigeria, and Nigeria is still going to need advanced pharmaceuticals and software from the United States.
Yeah. And if they do it on the basis of wage labor, it's going to just reproduce itself overnight, practically, the relations.
And yet it will have to be done that way. It's going to have to be done much more deliberately, politically mediated, right? In other words, you're not going to be able to just fob it off on some spurious technocratic stuff on the one hand, and on the other hand, some spurious market forces on the other hand. Right, because the market forces that exist now are not really market forces at all. They're strangely propped up by all sorts of state policies and administrative measures. Right, so in other words, the working class has to take over capitalism, like literally take over capitalism. It's a political change. And these things are going to have to be worked out. In other words, what is the basis of international trade be? It's going to have to be worked out, and it's not going to just be about eliminating the basis for trade now and trying to just sort of start from scratch. It certainly is going to be eliminating trade, and it's going to be based on some kind of adjudication of the value of labor. Of course it is, because how are you going to get people to do things in the United States and do things in Nigeria, right? There's going to have to be some social compulsion to labor, meaning in order to eat, you're going to have to work. That's going to be true in the advanced, like technologized capitalist countries, as well as in the manual laborized third world countries, right? It's going to still be there. It's just going to be mediated politically by the working class trying to achieve socialism. In other words, trying to overcome the problem of capital accumulation. Now, I'll say one more thing about capital accumulation there, which is to say, we still need to accumulate capital. We're still going to need to have savings. We're still going to need to have capital for investment. We're still going to have fungible value that you can take from one concrete activity and invest it in another concrete activity. We're still going to have to do that. But the working class is going to take responsibility politically for the problems therein. In a way that now it's technocratic bureaucrats and corporate capitalists and some strange capital market for investment funds. But the ledgers, the workers are going to have to take the ledgers, if you will, the software. They're going to have to take all the numbers in the capitalist economy that exists now. They're going to have to go to Wall Street and say, what the hell are you guys doing here after all? And let's look at these numbers, right? It's not like you're just gonna I don't know, smash the computers and delete the software, delete the records, delete the data. No, you're gonna have to start there.
Yeah, it's I'm glad it's going to be a whole bunch of people, and not just Doug by himself going in to try to figure it all out. We're going to have
no, right. It's going to be politically mediated. And there are going to be political parties. There are going to be labor unions. There are going to be governments. It's going to be politically mediated. The dictatorship of the proletariat just means, are the workers going to be, in some meaningful way in charge?
I mean, I feel like everything you said in the last couple of minutes now would be something that maybe Rockhill and others would agree with, Chris.
Maybe. Maybe. They might have a little bit of, they might have more bloodlust than that, Doug.
Right.
This might seem a little reformist or whatever, social democratic. It might seem like a little DSA-ish to them, what I'm saying.
Okay, but let's say you go in and you kill them all. You kill all the bankers. You're still going to have to set up relations between workers and
different countries. Yeah.
And of different countries and trade relations between states even, at first. I mean,
or between local governments of some kind.
Yeah. I wonder, it seems to me, and I really don't know, but it seems to me that what they imagine is that if only the global hegemon was
Knocked out.
China. No, it was China
Oh,
instead
it
of the
was
United
China.
States.
Mm-hmm.
Or if only the global hegemon was, Iran and Russia and China, that they were dominating the world, then that would be communism somehow, because they imagine that the complete control of society by the state is communism. And but I feel like that's maybe a straw man of their position.
State of the oppressed people. The state of the oppressed people. And then maybe if you just had like a really radical Democratic Party government in the United States, it could work. In other words, if it was all AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and Jamal Bowman, and if they were president and secretary of state and secretary of the treasury, if it was those guys, then they could work with China. I mean, right? So,
I feel like this whole conversation,
the right place. If it was like all queer women of color in the metropolitan world who all have their hearts in the right place, then
right, I guess. I feel like this is not a conversation people are actually having.
No, they're not really thinking. In other words, what they do is, because I was watching Gabriel Rockhill, and he's like, oh yeah, people who like the Frankfurt School, or people who like the French fries, who like French theory. He doesn't use French fries. That's my term. But, the problem is that they just are not on the side of the oppressed. Right? And I'm like, okay, so what? Gabriel Rockhill is like a tenured professor in the United States. So what's his role? His role is just to tell his students, give carte blanche to Hamas, because who are you to criticize the oppressed? Right? Because that's what it boils down to. Because I'm like, okay, so Gabriel Rockhill, you're basically saying intellectuals in the metropole have no role to play whatsoever except cheerlead whatever the third world people want to do.
And not even the third world people, but the oppressed in the third world.
Oh, sure. But, that's elastic, though, right? Because, they might be in favor of the PhD of the third world if they do the right thing. If they do the wrong thing, then they'll condemn them, right? But in reality, I mean, that's why I said, maybe they think that the PMC here, as long as they're women, queer, people of color who speak anti-imperialism, then it might be fine. Because that might be like a workers' state in their imagination. I mean, of course, I'm being cruel and uncharitable here. But, I'm just thinking, okay, so you're running around telling kids not to read the Frankfurt School because it will make you into a pro-imperialist. So what are they supposed to do? Just read Amilcar Cabral?
Well, why are you running around telling people not to read anything particularly? It's not, that's not,
But you know what I mean, right? It's like, don't read Adorno, but read the Combahee River Collective because they're black lesbians or something, right?
No,
I mean, I'm just like, okay, but what do you think the left or Marxists or socialists in the United States today should do? Right? Like, what do you think we should do? Because, of course, I don't think it really hinges on whether or not we support Hamas. Meaning that's not really decisive as to what we need to do here and now. Here. Right? Well, it's like some people might, wish well of Hamas, and some people might really detest Hamas. That really doesn't decide anything in terms of what happened here.
Yeah, I agree. I have a segue into my usual, pet cause at this point, so I'm going to hold off on it. But I have something to say about what I think the protests are about right now and why they do matter. But I'll hold it for the second half. But
we're back to 1968. We're back to the Columbia takeover, and we're back to what really does in the memory of Adorno. Why people hate Adorno. They don't hate Adorno for anything he wrote. They hate him for calling the cops on the students.
Oh, yeah. But I mean, look, it's a different moment.
That's the only reason they hate Adorno.
Right. Is it? But it is a different moment than
I mean, I can tell you as a faculty member, like, it comes down to me, which side am I on? Am I on the side of calling the cops or not? And of course I'm against calling the cops. That's what's put to me as a faculty member. What's put to me as a faculty member.
I mean, look, the faculty members at Columbia and Harvard and NYU, they are out there with the students protesting at the moment for the most part. But so they're not being protested the way Adorno was. But also,
I think he was protested for two reasons, right? So he certainly was protested for calling the cops. But before that, I guess the Institute in general was protested because of things that Horkheimer and Habermas had said in the media.
Right.
Right. They hadn't done anything, but they had said some things.
Right. So why I think this moment is different than 1968, and perhaps I'm wrong, but 1968 happened after the free speech movement at Berkeley. It happened during a time when there was more.
And by the way, I'll just say that Habermas and Horkheimer might have criticized the students. They might have said things like they're red fascists, but they still defended the students against the state.
Well, right, exactly. So,
right,
yeah. So, but in that moment, like a few years later, there would be the church committee. There was a weakening of the intelligence community and the amount of control that the.
Maybe there was a weakening. I don't know.
Anyway,
mean, did the church committee, or did they just like whitewash the intelligence community?
It was a combination.
Yeah, because it gave them a kind of veneer of legitimacy that they've only.
But they found that the rights of the students and others were violated by the FBI and by the COINTELPRO.
Yes, you know, that's true. That's
and right now we have a case before the Supreme Court where it's going to be decided whether or not people's rights are being violated in the same way by the same actors that were acting then. And the left in this moment is being oppressed by the same forces, both, you know, in terms of their speech and their right to assemble.
I put it very simply. The COVID safety restrictions are now being mobilized against the pro-Palestinian protesters.
That's right. So that is the lesson of this moment for the left, is to say, okay, wait, we should re-examine what we've been saying over the last few years. We should see ourselves in the same position as the protesters who, like the trucker convoy or the you know, and we should understand that we have a similar enemy here, and that there's no path back in. You know what
they'll say, though, Doug? That they'll say it matters what you represent. In other words, they'll just be very straightforward. People are like, there's no freedom of speech anyway, but we're only interested in defending the free speech of people who represent what we agree with. Right? Because how can you represent those fascists? Or how can you represent those people who are just like petty bourgeois, racist yahoos, conspiracy theorists? And it's like, well, you know, the left is a lot of conspiracy theory too. But, you know, leaving that aside, you know, like, it's like, you know, but anyway, you know, leaving that aside, that's what it would come down to. It would come down to people protesting against the Israeli genocide in Gaza represent something objectively that's progressive in a way that the trucker convoy did not.
Yeah, okay, but you know, no, sorry, no. If you're supporting Hamas, okay, what are you supporting? You're supporting a national liberation,
resistance to genocide.
Yeah, well,
resistance to slow motion genocide. Judith Butler, our favorite, armed resistance. Don't call them terrorists. It's armed resistance. We can dispute armed resistance, but let's call it what it is.
Okay, but it's also a national liberation struggle, and as a socialist, you would support that as a move towards creating conditions for socialism within the working class.
Yes, democratic self-determination of the people.
Right. So the trucker convoy, also about democratic self-determination and the rights of the democratic bourgeois right of those truckers. That's not different from why we would be supporting Hamas. It's more clear-cut in the case of the trucker convoy, I think. But, you know,
you would think, but again, they would just say, And these people think, of course, that the measures that the Chinese government took during COVID are good.
You know, I was listening to an unheard panel discussion about this just yesterday or maybe the day before. And one of the speakers said, you know, we talk about the Chinese lockdowns as really draconian, but they were much more limited than in the United States and in Europe. They were localized. So they didn't lock down everywhere. They never had vaccine passports.
Localized, but they were more draconian in their locality, but they were
right.
localized.
That's true. Yeah. So, you know, like it's 6 to 1, half dozen to the other, I think.
It's a little bit. And I also don't think that they compelled everybody to get a vaccine either because, well, in part because they didn't want to spend the money on vaccinating everybody.
Right.
But they were, you know, I think that they've been criticized on being too slack on the vaccination, which is why they had like a second wave COVID hit because they were insufficiently vaccinated. You know, but I think people in the West liked what the Chinese were doing because they saw it as more strict than here. In other words, whether that was actually true or not, they certainly wanted it to be more strict here.
Oh, I know.
And there was also even, let's not forget that people thought that the COVID lockdowns were in and of themselves a general strike. Do you remember that argument? That this is the overcoming of capitalism because workers should refuse to go to work out of safety concerns and the government should give them a living wage while they're locked down, and that will be the end of capitalism.
Yeah, and that was
let's forget, right?
Yeah, and Chris Smalls, the Amazon organizer, got his start basically organizing around how people were being forced to work under unsafe conditions during COVID.
Sure. Well, all work conditions were unsafe. In other words, the work had to get done, and for the work to get done meant unsafe. That's right. And that's why they vaccinated everybody, because basically the employers would have been sued for exposing their workers to COVID, and that's why they basically got the government to say everybody has to be vaccinated, so that they couldn't be sued for safety violations. And that goes for the masks too. So everybody's vaccinated, everybody wears masks, but they're still crowded together, sweating, panting, doing physical labor. Of course, they're still spreading COVID.
Yeah, but job. You know, the other thing that we've learned in the last couple of years is that the risk from COVID was overstated. It was really very variable depending on your comorbidities. Basically, if you're older or had a lot or sick.
Well, I mean, they were honest about that. They were honest. Fauci said, and I think even Trump's Surgeon General, the kind of young black guy who, you know, got a lot of crap for being Trump's the Surgeon General. They said, you know, you're wearing the mask, you're getting vaccinated to protect your grandma.
Yeah, but the thing is, it didn't protect,
and also to protect the hospitals, right? Let's not forget that.
Right,
and I just feel like, you know, how is it on me to protect the decrepit healthcare system in the United States?
But the vaccine didn't really slow transmission very much. Certainly, if someone got sick from it might keep you from getting sick and dying if you were vaccinated, if you got infected, but it didn't stop you from spreading it very much.
And they did lie about that, and they kind of deliberately lied about that, meaning they said it will stop the transmission. I think Fauci even said, and he knew that was wrong.
And the masks also, the meta-analysis shows it really didn't work to stop the transmission much either, except in the way that you've said, maybe by keeping people home for a while. But yeah, I mean, and then you add in the fact that the vaccine did cause death. Not very often, but sometimes.
And other health problems.
But in young men particularly, there was a not marginal, but not extreme. But
there was significant vaccine injury from these vaccines, these shots.
Yeah,
this medication, and that's
the risk to young men was greater from the vaccine than from COVID. Young women too. The risk from the vaccine was slightly greater, not huge, but it was slightly more
than the risk from COVID. If they got the infection. I mean, it's all very tricky. I mean, I would just say that apart from the concrete issues of this or that circumstance, and these emergencies that take place, because obviously, like, look, the protesters are going to have the cops called on them, the Palestinian protesters, for safety reasons, right? And it's not like that's just a totally bogus, right? But it has to do with, what do we mean by safety? Right? I mean, basically, schools already have an exaggerated notion of safety, including, I would go so far as to say, the crazy Title IX expansion under Obama.
I know.
Right?
And now,
and I know that
it just did it again.
Right. Well, Biden, restored it. And so, I kind of feel like, and also like, safety from, it's not only Title IX, maybe Title VI, like a safe environment for people of color. People can't feel like offended, trigger warnings. Like, you can't use like language, can't use the N-word, even if you're reading from a text, teaching like literature or philosophy, because it creates an unsafe environment that's discriminatory towards these protected classes of people, towards women or minorities. And it's kind of like,
and that's what that's what the neocons in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are trying to use to stop the pro-Palestinian.
They're claiming that Jewish students are made to feel unsafe on campus, and it's like made to feel unsafe, and then it becomes totally subjective. And so you have like Jewish protesters who are saying, "This is absolutely not true. This is a lie." Like, Jews are not being made to feel unsafe.
Those Jews don't count, Chris.
Well, I mean, in other words, it's totally subjective, meaning the campus rules that already exist basically say the school is supposed to do everything in its power to prevent anyone potentially feeling unsafe. So it's not about what people actually feel unsafe. It's about, are you creating a potentially unsafe space for anyone?
Yeah, I know. No, it's ridiculous.
And so of course it's going to be weaponized. How would it not be weaponized? It already was weaponized, right?
Yeah.
And how could it not be weaponized against the left?
Yeah.
I mean, just, basic. But again, we shouldn't instrumentalize it all that much. Meaning we shouldn't say, oh, see, you now need free speech protection. You didn't think you did, but now you do. And it's kind of like, well, yes, but maybe we should defend free speech as a principle and get rid of the safety idea. Maybe ideas are important and good and worth freedom because they're dangerous, because they are offensive, because they do like shake you up. They do cause you to lose sleep at night. They do make you wonder about your place in the world.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if ideas don't do that, then then they're kind of worthless.
Oh, well, I mean, they can keep you placated for a little while, that you can.
Right. In other words, exactly. The critical versus the affirmative, right? In other words, yes. Freedom of speech, as long as it's all affirmative, do you remember, is it the Saturday Night Live skit? So we're two old guys, so we have to invoke the old Saturday Night Live. Is it Tavis? No. Is it somebody Smiley? Like,
oh, yeah.
I'm okay, I'm a good person, like looking in the mirror.
Right. It was the guy who was a senator. He got kicked out for sexual harassment.
Oh shit, that's right. That's right.
What was his name?
Comedian.
Terrible.
I know.
Stuart Smiley was his name.
Stuart Smiley was the character.
Right. And this is okay. Al Franken was
Al Franken, of course. Al Franken.
Right. Yeah. So
it's kind of like ideas are good as long as they do that for people.
Stuart Smalley was his name, actually, not even Smiley.
Smalley, not Smiley. Smalley.
Yeah.
Smalley.
Yeah. See, we're having
a senior
old, maybe.
We're definitely having a senior moment here, Doug.
Yeah.
No, in all seriousness, like, again, critical theory. I mean, here's the thing with critical theory. And something that I addressed in the symptomology essay in The Death of the Millennial Left which is like critical ideas do ineluctably become affirmative. They become kind of entertaining ideas. In other words, they become kind of stimulating but also comforting kind of notions of the world. Like even like, like the panopticon and biopolitics and power knowledge discourse, it tends to like help comfort people in a strange way. It sort of like describes the world and reconciles people to the world. And Marxism can do that too. In other words, that it can become like a worldview that basically makes you feel like you understand the meaning of things and sort of reduces the existential terror, right? And it's like, the Frankfurt School can be used for that too. All ideas can be abused in this way. And I'm interested in the way these ideas challenge us.
Yeah.
And again, Lenin can just be a so story. Like Lenin's on the side of the oppressed and the exploited. And see, Lenin's good because he supported anti-colonial struggles. And I'm like, okay, like Lenin's on the right side of things. And it's like, but the only value of these figures is if they cause you to question your assumptions about the right and wrong side of things. Like it's kind of easy to say, yeah, people that are being carpet bombed by the United States.
Yeah, we should feel bad for them.
Yeah. Do you need to be a Marxist to say that? No. Do you need Lenin? And maybe they should shoot down some of the bombers. Like,
yeah, they have the right to, I think. As long as I'm not in the plane, don't shoot me.
Right. Nobody forces you to be a bomber pilot. They might have forced you to be a general infantry in the jungle, but nobody forces you to be a fighter pilot.
I think there's a thing that happens every once in a while when you've accepted an idea and you've kind of built it into your worldview. But you can still be susceptible to thinking when you realize it's true. Then it's like, right. like with the Society of Spectacle, it's like, oh yeah, I live in the Society of Spectacle. Yeah. And then lately I've been like, oh shit, I'm in the
and it hits home, and then you're like, oh,
and I don't like it at all, and I want it to stop. Like
right.
This is, it's not like I'm cool because I know. It's like, no, I'm completely alienated because I can see this and I want it to stop. Right. We're all one-dimensional men. It's like, oh yeah, we are, and we're fucked because
right. So it's an entertaining idea until it becomes too real.
Right, and also when you can see it developing, when you can say, oh,
it's even worse now than it was then.
Yeah. And I definitely feel that way lately, that it's like, oh, yeah.
Those 60s people, they were like screaming from the rooftops. They didn't realize they had it so good.
Well, right. Yeah. I mean, I can see why
they're calling LBJ a fascist,
Yeah.
They're calling LBJ a fascist, but LBJ still had the decency to resign.
That's
to not run for office. Right? So, he might have been a fascist sociopath, but not nearly as much these people were dealing with.
That's true. God. And I have to say, and this is, I shouldn't have to say this or it's going to give the game away to my detractors. I'm disappointed in Trump right now, the way he's been, helping to get like the FISA bill re-upped and to get the funding for these wars and all of that, and not being an oppositional type.
No, it's all what he's doing, Doug Trump.
Mm-hmm.
He's preserving the status quo because he wants this. He doesn't want to be thrown any curveballs for his negotiating position coming in. Meaning, it's one of these things, and he also doesn't want like a total debacle on the part of the Republicans because he might need them, right? So he can't have a total implosion, so he's willing to make concessions, right? I mean, it's all very treacherous. I mean, obviously he's an opportunist, and he's not an opportunist just in the moral sense, but politically. And he's a centrist, meaning at the end of the day, yeah, he's willing to make compromises, And he basically he tried to save Mike Johnson's speakership. He tried to save Kevin McCarthy's speakership too, because he realizes that this is undoing the Republican majority.
Right, but I mean, look, I just remember. Oh, to me, this is reminding me of Obama.
Mm-hmm.
Obama was like going to come in there. He promised he's going to do something about the Patriot Act and about the surveillance. And he was a constitutional scholar and he cared about these issues. And before he even took office, I think before he won,
he indicated
he gave an assent to. He stopped the telecommunications companies from. He protected the telecommunications companies from litigation based on their violation of the First Amendment. There was a law that was put through to to shelter them for their previous activity.
Oh, right. Collusion. Yeah.
Yeah. And he was in there and was like, right. So because they were entwined with the government, they were violating people's rights, the right to privacy. And they passed a law saying, no, we'll protect you from litigation on that.
I mean, look, what it boils down to is that there are certain things that Trump cares about that are primary, and there are other things that are secondary. And some of the secondary things that he doesn't care as much about are the things that he needs to win election. Right? And so that's always the trick with Trump, is that he's got to rhetorically represent some things. Now, what's interesting, so, when Nick Kiersey, interviewed me on the stream last week from Texas, he pointed out something that I still have to hunt down, which is that people at the Trump rally were chanting Genocide Joe, and Trump said they're not wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, but he'll play both sides. In other words, he'll say Israel is, it's wrong for the Democrats to criticize Israel. But then he'll also say, that the protesters, the anti-Biden protesters who are calling him Genocide Joe, are not wrong. And so, because basically his bottom line is the whole thing's a fiasco. The whole thing's a fuck up. And, and he would handle things better. And, it's kind of like, it's not any great political claims. It's not any claims on principle. Not really. No. I mean, some things... the Republicans generally tend to stand for civil liberties against some things. I mean, what was pointed out, I think, during the TV hearings files, was it pointed out that the Trump administration had called for the suppression of some tweet or other?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
No. And I mean, look, the Republicans were the ones who formed the Department of Homeland Security and passed the Patriot Act and launched the Total Information Awareness Program that developed into the spying that Snowden revealed. I mean, it's not like, but then again, Clinton was the one who passed the first Anti-Terrorism Act after 1996 or 97.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. That's right.
That, eliminated a due process. Yeah.
Guantanamo Bay was set up under that, not under the Patriot Act.
Right. So, I mean, it's been a bipartisan shit show on this front for a long time, and we should all accept that. Yeah, you know what? They don't want us to speak up or organize or think overall, and we should want to.
That's right. That's right. But I think again on the left, there's a lot of complacency, and basically people are willing to be cynical about these things. And just say, we want to protect our rights, but not the rights of our opponents. And they're pretty straightforward about it. In other words, it's not like they're not hidden or bashful about that. They're just like, well, are you on the right side or the wrong side? If you're on the wrong side, you should have no rights. I mean, it's like they're pretty straightforward about it. And I kind of feel like I'm here to make a plea for, can we know up front, is it that cut and dried?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if I felt so confident that I absolutely knew who was on the right side and who was on the wrong side, I would want to have the power to shut people up and to shut people down, because I'd be right. I would know I was right. And when I do think that I'm absolutely right, I'm pretty terrible. So, I can be a real asshole at that point.
Right.
But I happen to know that often enough I'm wrong. And that my first impression.
There's what you called epistemic humility. I mean, here's the deeper issue, which I don't think really applies exactly to our situation today. I guess in some broad sense, it would still apply to our situation today. Mm-hmm. Who's on the right side of history, who's on the wrong side of history, and can we adjudicate that confidently, entirely? Especially because all sorts of reforms have paradoxical outcomes and things invert in value. But on the Lenin point, and why Lenin was near and dear to the Frankfurt School, because he represented the division in Marxism, the crisis of Marxism. He's a protagonist in the struggle within Marxism itself. And, again, it's not like, oh, well, there was a struggle in Marxism because some people sold out and other people didn't. No, people plausibly on both sides in the crisis in Marxism thought that they were on the right side. Meaning, Kautsky being anti-Bolshevik, he legitimately, as a Marxist, thought that he represented the true interests of socialism as opposed to Lenin, who was compromising in the name of the Russian Revolution. That was not going to lead to socialism. Now, I mean, there are reasons to maybe be more sympathetic to Lenin and less sympathetic to Kautsky. But the point is that what Lenin represents, and I feel he represents a wound, if you will, in history. The reason he's a controversial figure is that he does represent division in Marxism, division on the socialist left. And that's what makes people uncomfortable. And that's where it's kind of like, especially I just remember with the millennial left, there was this move, and the DSA was supposed to be some kind of realization of this, of left unity. Right? Can we put these ideological divisions aside? Can we have left unity? Can we rebuild the movement on a unified basis? Or are we just going to be all in our cubby holes? Right? And I think that part of the aversion to Lenin is that he represents that. Right? So when people encounter Leninism in the world today, they're encountering the sectarian organizations.
Right. He represents the disintegration of the center.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying. Yeah.
And that's where I feel like, but as a signifier, we were talking about that, the Lenin cat memes, Jody Dean. But as a signifier, okay, at the very least, Lenin poses a question, which is, why was there a crisis of Marxism? Because that's a simple answer to that. It's not like, oh, one side is pro-imperialist, the other side is anti-imperialist.
Certainly not that, no.
It's not as simple as that. And I feel like, it's a way of, we do need to reopen this history and challenge our assumptions, challenge our certitudes. At a very basic level. Look, Tucker Carlson is an anti-imperialist.
He is.
And that might commend him, but it also make us stop and wonder for a second. Okay, is all anti-imperialism good?
Yeah, Dugin is an anti-imperialist, isn't he?
Putin, of course, is, and the mullahs in Iran are.
I guess.
I mean, they're against the U.S. imperial hegemony. Yeah. I just remember before the millennial left, Doug, do you remember Empire by Hart and Negri?
Yeah, I do.
And despite the title of that book, the point of that book was that it's not an empire the way the old empires were. The entire point of that book is we need to rethink our theory of imperialism because it's not the situation it was 100 years ago. That's the entire point of that book.
Yeah. In fact, Empire was potentially liberating, according to Hart and Negri.
Yeah.
And I read it again, and I didn't agree with them very much because I read them in around 2010 or something, because I heard about it. It was, a hot new book. Everyone should read Empire. People who are not political, not Marxist, Empire. I have it on my coffee table.
It's very much a 90s book.
Yeah, 1999, I think, right?
Mm-hmm. So it's about like the emancipatory potential of the new globalized capitalist order.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
It was post-Marxist, but it's probably worth returning to again.
Yeah, there's some interesting things to it. There are.
Yeah.
And but it certainly isn't pro-imperialist. No. It's anti-imperialist, but it also is saying, look, the left has to think of these things differently because it's not the same situation. It's not like some system of hierarchy among nations. It's not something. Basically, the bottom line was you can't deal with the problems of global capitalism by adopting a nationalist perspective.
Right. Yeah.
That was the basic point. And of course, now, 24 years later, right, 25 years later, a quarter of a century later, where are we? We're in a total nationalist nightmare. Everybody's a nationalist now.
No, I know. I mean, the thing is, literally everyone. Biden's a nationalist. Trump.
Sohrab
Amari. Yeah, I just put up an interview with him. They're all Tucker Carlson. Yes. Putin. Yeah, all of it. Everyone is a nationalist, and why? Because everyone is seeing the crack up of neoliberalism, and some sort of onshoring and national sovereignty is coming back in as a way to manage the crisis. It's not like it's not gonna work exactly. It's just gonna fail in the right way to keep everything going.
Right. I mean, I point out in my article on Israel, Palestine, and the left, which is in this book, which is in the Marxism and Politics book, that nationalism is the problem because it's a ready ideology for maintaining capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in many ways, neoliberalism was still very nationalistic.
Yeah.
But at least Hamas weren't nationalists, right? They're Islamists. And yet the left can only justify Hamas as nationalist. In other words, like the left justification for Hamas is that they're the leaders of the national liberation struggle of the Palestinians. And they just sort of set aside the fact that actually Hamas are not nationalists. They don't care about the Palestinian nation. They care about Islam.
Right.
They really care about, and that's to their credit, by the way, because of, again, Islamism came out of the failure of Arab nationalism. Like why did the PLO fall, if you will, from grace, and then they're replaced by Hamas? Why did the PFLP, the Marxists in Palestine, why did they switch from supporting the PLO to supporting Hamas? Because they basically said the PLO are sellouts, they've abandoned the national struggle, Hamas are the leaders of the national struggle. So they have the Stalinist justification for Hamas. It's like, but wait a second, Hamas are not nationalists. Like if you ask them, and so they have to do, well, Hamas is objectively in the position of leading the national liberation struggle, and they don't care about the ideology. And it's like, yeah, but people are joining Hamas instead of joining the PFLP because they're Islamists, they're not nationalists. And that does matter.
Yeah.
Like it matters, the vision matters. And, the Marxists are just there to sort of give these spurious categories, to just say
Islam is an international project.
It's cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
Right? It is a kind of like now, today, perhaps a relic of the more neoliberal, globalized capitalist era.
Mm-hmm. Listen, what we should wrap it up. We've been an hour and 40 minutes. I want to do a second half. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.